Welcome to Asian Book Club, where we highlight Asian and Asian American authors. We are your hosts,
Jamae and Sabangan.
and I'm Stephen Park. And today we're on our second read of The Storm We Made by Vanessa Chan. In this book, we are seeing a lot of different character interactions. We're seeing people go through ups, but mainly we're seeing a lot of people go through downs. The interesting thing is how people tend to deal with that. And one of the things that kind of stood out to me was the interaction between Cecily and Mrs. Yap, or now known as Lena. So what we see is, before Lena appears, is that Mrs. Yap's husband passes away. This is if you've read all the story, which I'm hoping that you did.
He didn't pass away. I think he was murdered.
Right. He's no longer on this planet within this book. But Mrs. Yap's reaction is pretty bad. Like, she goes through what seemingly looks like a depression. It's her not being able to find support, which then ends up exasperating more of her sadness and her loneliness.
Yeah.
And we get this point where Cecily is able to meet up with Mrs. Yap, and there's some form of communication. Not really comforting, because Cecily isn't looking to comfort Mrs. Yap. It doesn't look like anyone is.
No, not at all.
And it seems very much like all of Mrs. Yap's behavior in terms of her stuck-upness or her...
I think it was less that she was stuck up, but more loud, and her personality was very big, and people didn't like that about her.
But it also seemed like she came off as privileged in a way.
Oh, absolutely.
Because her husband was someone of power.
Right, he was the clan leader.
Right, and if you don't set up a bed of pillows under you with people that can support you, usually you're going to fall on a bed of nails.
Right.
Which is kind of what happens to Mrs. Yap. Now, with this scenario, what we see is Cecily having an opportunity to comfort Mrs. Yap, but instead abandons her both physically and emotionally, and probably mentally, and just leaves out the back door.
Right.
For me, I was trying to think of what I'd do in this scenario, because I'm someone that tends to hold a lot of grudges. I value loyalty pretty highly in my life, and when that goes the other way, I become super petty, which isn't good. Like, this is not a great characteristic. It's something I've talked to with a therapist about. How do you overcome this feeling of wanting, not necessarily negativity towards someone, but wanting a form of resolve that would make me feel better? But I don't feel like you feel that way.
I don't hold grudges, and I was thinking the same thing. In that same moment, I was wondering what I would do, and I wouldn't have walked out the door. I would have literally gotten water for Mrs. Yap. I would have stayed there and comforted her. I would have continued to be a friend, even though I don't consider this person a friend, but essentially being that shoulder to cry on.
Right. I also don't do a great job of pretending to be someone. Not saying that that's where you would have gone, but I don't think that, for me personally, I could have stayed there and pretended to be a friend for her or a support system, because that wouldn't have been where my heart was at. So I felt like, for me, I still don't know what I would have done. I don't know if I would have walked away. Honestly, I probably still would have been there to care for the person, but in a much more perfunctory way, like deliver the water and then walk out the back door, so that it's not me actually feeling like I need to care for the person, because it's not that I wouldn't care for them as a human being, I just wouldn't want to be their support system.
Fair. I think I have so much compassion, and as a spicy person, it's hard for me to figure out where to end the kindness, so my kindness just keeps going.
I do very basic needs, and then beyond that depends on the levels that I am committed to our relationship, whoever that person is.
Fair. That's fair.
I don't know. I thought that was a very interesting scene. It seemed like something that could easily be glanced over.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But for some reason, that very much stuck out in my mind of what were the possibilities that could have gone on here. Because what we later notice is that, like I said, Mrs. Yap turns into Lena, who is not General Fujimura, but his alias, Bing Li Chan. She ends up becoming his wife. So who knows, if Cecily had been there to take care of Mrs. Yap, would this scenario have been different? Would they have formed a bond that made Mrs. Yap want to stay? I mean, we still don't know what has really happened to form that relationship. But interesting thing to think about as someone who would have probably done something more similar to Cecily than to Mrs. Yap. But I think one thing that we should do as humans, but maybe also women to women, is maybe support each other.
Absolutely.
And that's going to lead to our recommendation for the week.
Our recommendation for the week is AAPI Women Lead. It's a community organization focused on Asian and Pacific Islander women. Currently, their newest project is the #I'm Ready movement, which aims to strengthen the progressive social and political platforms of API or Asian Pacific Islander communities through the leadership of API women, girls, and gender-expansive communities. The goal for them is to end the violence against and within our communities. You can learn more about their work through their website at imreadymovement.org, or you can learn more about their overall work on Instagram at AAPI Women Lead.
Yep, and that's going to be our recommendation for the week. Okay, we're on our second read of The Storm We Made by Vanessa Chan. This time we read pages 83 to 164 on the physical copy, or chapters 7 through 13 on whatever source you're deciding to read this on. What have we learned from our first read prior to this one?
So, to recap, we learned about the Alcantara family. We know that there's Cecily, who we just talked about is kind of coarse in nature. There's Gordon, the husband, or the father to the children, who is an important man, or becoming an important man, in the public works sector. We also learned about the 3 children, who were the other points of view in the story. Jujubee, the oldest, who seems to be the one...
Caretaker of the children.
The caretaker of the children. We learned about Abel, who unfortunately got kidnapped, and then Jasmine, the youngest, who is the most innocent of them all.
Absolutely. We also learned about General Fujiwara, who is a big piece within this, even though his point of view isn't given out.
Right.
He is the general who ends up eventually overtaking the British colonization of Malaysia or Malaya. And he is in this role with Cecily that is now developing within this current read that we're going through.
Yes. And for those who haven't read yet, or who haven't really touched the book at all, a few content warnings up top. There is mention of murder and alcoholism, and there's still references to sexual assault. Right.
So we are going to go into the major character developments that go on. And once again, the character viewpoints are through Cecily, Jujubee, Abel, and Jasmine. So let's talk about what Cecily's development looks like within this read.
So with Cecily, up top, we know that she's become overwhelmed and anxious because a fire breaks out at the port.
Right. A fire that seemingly she was incorporated with.
Right, because she was part of the scheme to get the information of the layout and of the different ports and the systems that were in place for the different vehicles in that area.
Right, because seemingly no one else should have known besides the British troops.
Right.
And so now the British are looking for a spy and interrogating people and even killing off people within this their interrogation, which is how the aforementioned Mrs. Yap is now a widow.
Right. And people are taken in for questioning, and surprisingly, Gordon is not worried.
Right. He's pretty confident in the fact that he is someone that is supportive of the British troops.
Right. His loyalty overcomes all that questioning.
Right. On the other hand, this is where we see kind of the crumbling of Cecily.
Yes. She gets very worried. She doesn't hear from General Fujiwara anymore. No communication at all. No direction.
Right.
And he disappears from her life altogether.
Right.
And so leaves her feeling like, what happens if they do capture me? What happens if they do find out that I was a spy for the Japanese imperialistic army?
Right. Which is sad because... on the other hand, Gordon is there and he's taking time off of work to specifically try to take care of Cecily.
Right.
But all she's caring about is Fujiwara.
Yep.
Not only is it that Fujiwara might be the link to how the British forces find her, but also their relationship and how broken it is.
Exactly.
The other interesting thing that I saw was when we read through Jujubee's story, one of the things that was mentioned was how she saw Cecily, which is this now anxious, kind of broken down person.
Right.
And Jujubee specifically mentions that her mom wasn't always this way. So Jujubee's story kind of came before all this stuff came to light. And I felt like it kind of rounded out the story of, okay, this is why Cecily's character is developing into the way that it is.
And not only is Gordon taking care of Cecily in terms of trying to figure out what's happening to her, he's taking care of the entire family, and that not only is he not questioned, but he is promoted to the highest position a non-British person can be in the public works department.
Right.
And so they get so comfortable that they're able to afford a maid.
Right. Afford a maid. They're going to all these parties.
Yes.
And at this point in time, as we're approaching the end of our read, we're getting into, I think, the second chapter of Cecily's. And what we see is that Cecily and Gordon's relationship is now mending, or it's growing. Like, they seem to now be more of a couple than they ever were.
Right. They're no longer two separate beings just living in the same house.
Right.
They're actually husband and wife. They're actually looking like it says in the book, they might not be a gorgeous couple, but they're a handsome couple.
Right. This all kind of comes to a possible screeching stop as Cecily enters a very fancy party at this only British country club, and she runs into this figure that is this Mrs. Yap 2.0, also known as Lena. And not only that, but like we said, Lena is now married to Fujiwara, aka
Bingley-chan.
Right. So this kind of brings her world crumbling down. We also see that Cecily comes into this secondary encounter with Fujiwara at this seedy motel room and has this weird encounter where Fujiwara kind of attacks her and then just leaves, seemingly from a burst of emotion that is occurring.
Right. Less attack, but approaches her very intensely.
I mean, he held her against the wall by her throat.
Okay, I guess that is an attack.
That is absolutely an attack.
I forgot that he grasped her throat. I just remember him pinning her to the wall and being aroused.
I know. Also, she seemed aroused.
Yeah.
From the second comment of, like, once he left, she was aroused.
Right.
I don't know. It seems to be their relationship. That
Right.
It's a little bit tumultuous, but there's a fiery kind of passion within this.
Yes. There's just a lot of... For me, there's just a lot of questions in my head after that encounter.
Right. It seems like there could be a spin-off with Sarah Smith writing a book about this.
With Fujiwara half naked in the kitchen.
Yes. So that's kind of Cecily's story at this point. We are figuring out a lot of things about her life. I think the most details out of all characters has come out within Cecily's.
Yes.
But when we talk about the other characters, one of the other large storylines is Abel. Now, his doesn't affect the family. His doesn't affect Fujiwara.
No.
His seems to only affect him.
Himself.
Right. Also, kind of Freddy. Because Freddy's such a big part in this.
Right, who we're just introduced to in this section.
Well, we kind of meet him through the side of our eyes when we're reading the first story. Because he is in the original cell that Abel was in.
True. But we get to know more about his story in this section.
Absolutely.
We find out that besides Abel, Freddy is the most picked on among the group of boys.
Right. Not only that, but one of the biggest things is that Freddy was also captured by Brother Luke.
Right.
So we find this kinship between the two, not only through how they're kind of the bottom of the barrel within this camp, but the fact that they both have the same captor.
Right, they have the same captor, and the way that Freddy and Abel look are very similar in that they're the lightest skin tone.
Right.
Which is why they're getting all this harshness from the guards.
Right.
And in addition, their kinship continues to grow when Freddy, in the middle of the night, continues to rustle.
Right.
And so Abel is curious and ends up finding out that Freddy is trying to remember all that's happening to them.
Yeah, so this terrifies me because Freddy seems like such a sweet kid. He seems very, very kind, and usually these books don't end up well for people who are kind.
Right.
I think with the way that the story is told and how Freddy is talking about wanting to remember these instances and putting physical pen to paper to have those inscribed somewhere,
Right.
it makes me a little scared that something bad happens to Freddy.
I didn't think about that, but now that you've laid out how kind he is and how aware he is of the situation, he's absolutely gonna not have a great ending.
The other scary part for me is how much the author emphasizes his blue eyes. There's so many references to Freddy's blue eyes. Like, every time he's mentioned, it almost goes straight to how deep his eyes are.
Right.
And I feel like, is there a scene where the way we find out that Freddy has passed is by this glimpse of only being able to see the color of those eyes that Abel will remember? Quick prediction, something I absolutely thought about and I'm terrified of because Freddy seems so extremely sweet. Because one of the things that we see in terms of kindness from Freddy is how much he takes care of Abel throughout these instances.
Right, especially because Abel, as we find out in this section, is addicted to this toddy because unlike Freddy, he wants to forget everything.
Right.
And one of the things he wants to forget is, unfortunately, the only way for him to get out of the coop was to murder.
Yeah, so this toddy is seemingly a form of alcohol.
Yeah.
And one of the things that ends up happening within the storyline is that Master Akiro drops in this body that comes to light is Brother Luke.
Yeah, into the same coop.
Exactly. Abel is able to recognize it pretty immediately. We also get this scene of all the other children watching. Like, I feel like Abel at this point doesn't have much of a choice because Master Akira is holding this drink that Abel smells and is craving because of his addiction.
Right.
There's a rebar there. He knows that if he doesn't do anything, Brother Luke might kill him.
Right.
The other kids are watching. Freddy is also within the midst of these children who has previously said that he would like to kill Brother Luke if he got the opportunity. So in Abel's mind, he can solve his addiction, he can get himself out of the chicken coop, he can help his friend out, he can avoid himself being killed. So I don't feel like he has a choice.
Right, and he's also avenging himself.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, on top of all that, he's getting the person that
brought him into this situation in the first place.
Right. Just the fact that he had this stall in what his mentality was and what he was going to pursue with just shows what his character actually is. But yeah, truly, I don't think he could have made another choice.
Right. And while I was reading it, I don't think he was doing it out of malice. He was doing it out of survival.
Right, exactly. Although the way that it's described is pretty brutal.
Yeah.
And it still haunts Abel throughout the rest of the time there.
Right, exactly. Because he keeps going back to the chicken coop every night and Freddy keeps having to bring him back to the barracks.
Right. Which made me think of a dog. Like, when dogs are kennel trained, what they'll do is they'll go to their spot of comfort, which is the kennel. I wonder if this is a space that he now feels some form of comfort in. Maybe not with the killing, but maybe that corner that he kind of was able to at least be alone.
Right, and he had space for himself.
Exactly.
He wasn't, like, up against anyone else.
Right. So that's the first thought that came to mind when the story talked about him constantly returning to this cage every night. Freddy is there for him. He brings him water. He helps him when he's throwing up to avoid him from choking and suffocating. It's a relationship that's blooming and I think is going to continue to grow, which is also why I think bad things are going to happen to Freddy.
Right.
But that's where we leave off with Abel.
Yes.
But then we get to... We're kind of starting to get to some lighter stories, I think. Not lighter. Less horrific stories.
Kind of. So,
Jujubes, I think, was the least of the horrific stories.
This was in the first read.
Right. Her story actually didn't start with her chapter within this read. It actually started in Jasmine's chapter.
Right.
So we'll get to Jasmine's whole story, but what we know from last time is that Jasmine escaped with Yuki, and it's clearly something that Jujube doesn't want because Jujube doesn't want Jasmine to get captured or kidnapped. So eventually, when Jujube is able to put two and two together and Jasmine is honest about having left home with Yuki, Jujube gets really angry, grabs Jasmine by the hair, and then pulls her into the basement and tells her that she can't come out.
Right, and not only that, but unscrews the light bulb knowing that Jasmine is afraid of the dark.
Right, and also clicks in the latch that locks her in the basement.
Mm-hmm.
So Jujubee is not necessarily trying to hurt her sister.
No.
But it's the only way that she feels at this point that she can protect Jasmine.
Protect her and also discipline her.
Right. She's trying to make Jasmine understand the ramifications for how dangerous it is to go outside.
Exactly.
The issue is she's also, 14? Like, she's not...
She's 18.
She's 18. Like, she's not old enough to be a mother that understands what these ramifications are. Like, she's not old enough to understand how to create proper punishments or disciplines, because she herself is still a child.
True, but she's also the only one who's giving any discipline, because unfortunately Cecily doesn't think that this is the way to discipline her. Gordon's not wanting to discipline her either.
Right. So where we start in Jujubee's chapter is her in the tea house because she went off to work.
Mm-hmm.
And she is not necessarily regretting her decision, but she's trying to figure out how to amend for it. And while she's thinking that, in walks Mr. Takahashi.
Yes.
And he actually has good news.
Right. He's happy because he finds out that his daughter is still alive because she was often vacationing and visiting an aunt.
Right. For Jujubee, though, it's not necessarily good news.
Right. It says on page 116 that all Jujubee could think was, these people, they're invaders. When they dared to hope, they were rewarded for it. He would get his daughter back, and the price, it seemed, was something she had to pay with Jasmine.
Right. So it maybe for Jujubee seems like a sacrifice.
Right.
Like she had to give up her sister so that Mr. Takahashi can have his daughter back. Which absolutely isn't. Like, these have nothing to do with each other.
No. Which we failed to mention, the reason why she has to give up Jasmine is because Jasmine runs away.
Right. That's the big thing that happens with Jasmine.
Right.
She runs away because of the fact that Cecily lets Jasmine out to give her some treats.
To comfort her.
Right. But at that point, Jasmine's like, nope, this family's trying to kill me. And she just, like, leaves.
She bolts out.
Right. So as Jujubee gets this news from Mr. Takahashi in the tea house, in walks in Cecily with that news.
Yeah.
So immediately following this, like, okay, like, maybe there's a little bit of good news, Jujubee finds out pretty immediately that her sister is nowhere to be found.
Exactly.
That's, for the most part, Jujubee's story at this point.
Yes. She is the only one who is holding the family together, and for that, she is the one who has to pay for that responsibility.
Right. Even though her story and her narrative is short,
Mm-hmm.
we see how her story plays out through the eyes of other people.
Exactly.
But that brings us to Jasmine. So we kind of started off with where Jasmine's story is.
Mm-hmm.
She came back from her outing with Yuki. She gets found out. She gets pulled into the basement. Cecily lets her out to give her treats. And then Jasmine bolts. She leaves and runs away.
Right, and she finds herself in the chemist shop, and at the chemist shop, the assistant, Pick Loom, assists her with her feet because it's hurting.
Right.
And while Pick Loom is assisting Jasmine, in comes Fujiwara.
Right. Which I think it was when we were reading Jujubee's perspective, we find out that Cecily kind of beckons Fujiwara.
She wants to.
Right, she's trying to look for help, and she says, this guy owes me something.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say Fujiwara's name, but honestly, who else could it be,
yeah.
right? So, like you said, Fujiwara finds Jasmine, and it doesn't seem like he's in that pharmacy for any other reason.
Exactly.
He doesn't stop by to get drugs. He specifically seems to be looking for Jasmine.
Right. He takes her in,
Mm-hmm.
brings her home, and Jasmine stays with him for several nights, it seems.
Right, and by taking her in, you're talking about into his own home.
Exactly.
With his own houseboy taking care of her, feeding her, clothing her, giving her comfort.
Exactly.
Almost giving her the safety tag, which is the clothing that he gives her, which has his name on it.
Right.
So if any soldier finds Jasmine, she should be
pretty safe.
Yeah, they can't hurt her. So she is now probably in the best spot that she's ever been in.
Right. And he also doesn't trap her inside the house. He
Right,
kind of
right,
lets her roam.
Well, he lets her roam inside the house. He doesn't put restraint on her.
Right.
But I don't think he understands the full extent of what Jasmine's doing. Because Jasmine now, being Jasmine apparently, escapes the confines of this household because she gets bored and eventually finds herself with Yuki again in this very scary spot where children are being used for their bodies.
True.
So it talks about how Jasmine is skirting away, coming in at certain times so that no one really knows what's happening. Fujiwara is a very smart guy. He may know this whole thing is happening already, but I don't think he's giving her permission necessarily to go out.
That's fair. Something that came to mind, considering all the time that they spend together, all the time that he tells Jasmine stories, and the one comment that he made one night when he asked, "Do you like to read books?" and her answer was no.
Right.
He said, "Well, you're not like your mother and me."
Right. Who have joined the Asian book club.
So the possible plot twist that happened in my mind was, is Jasmine Fujiwara's daughter?
So we share show notes pretty much right before we do the show. I read that and I was like, oh, that'd be a big plot twist. But then I started thinking about it and I'm like, I don't think that could happen, because when we read Cecily's story, it's 9 years ago and the children are already born.
Only Jujubee and Abel are born.
Really?
Yes.
Interesting. I mean, as soon as I read that, I was like, oh, that could be the reason why he's so interested in her.
And could also be the reason why the family was so insistent. Like, maybe Jujubee doesn't know, but I'm pretty sure that Cecily might be hiding her for that reason.
Is there any talk of her skin tone being different than the other kids?
Not really. I don't think there's any difference in the way that she looks, but there's definitely a difference in the way that she acts.
Right. Possibly. I mean, we'll see. She's definitely being favored by Fujiwara for some reason. I thought it was because of the love that he had for Cecily, which we are finding more that it was a sexual relationship. Now it's like we know that there was stuff sexual that happened. Tension. Yeah. They did the shaky boom boom. But
well, we're not sure if they did the shaky boom boom.
Oh no, there were definitely like insinuations. Yeah. So I'm fairly certain that it happened. But I guess putting timelines together, maybe that is a possibility.
Yeah, because Jasmine is much younger than both of her siblings.
Right.
Jujubee is 18 and Abel's 15 and she's 7.
Right.
There's a huge age gap difference. And 9 years ago is when
they first met up.
Yes, is when Fujiwara came back into Cecily's life.
Right. Possible.
Yes. So who knows? We'll see. Speaking of the timeline changes, have the timeline shifts and flashbacks gotten easier to manage since the first read?
I think they've gotten easier to manage, but I also think I'm paying more attention to the front of the chapters where we see what period of time that they're in.
Right.
Because it then sets my mind to put myself in that location. Like I said, I don't do well with timeline shifts. I don't do well with flashbacks and things like that just because I like a story that's very linear. So I think if I don't put a conscious effort to it, I can very easily get lost.
That's fair. For me, it has also gotten easier, and also that the timeline shifts are between two very distinct times, British occupation versus Japanese occupation. I feel like that, to me, has made it so that my mind is able to catch up really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. To be honest, the other thing that I felt like with this read was during the first half of this read, the story was getting a little bit stale for me. I was kind of like, okay, where is this going? What is happening? The part that really twisted it and turned it over for me was the finding of Lena, Mrs. Yap 2.0. I was like, oh, shoot, okay, what's happening? Because that really made it so that, like, my eyes opened wide and I was like, okay, the story has much more depth than I thought it did. So I am much more excited about the read now at the ending of our second read than I was kind of in the middle of it. I do think that things are finally starting to pick up as well, which makes the read a little bit easier.
And did you feel that way even after Abel's chapter?
Yeah, because Abel's chapter is a story, but it doesn't seem to be going anywhere.
Like, it doesn't, like you mentioned earlier, it doesn't directly affect the family because the family is separated from him.
Right. So I'm sure it's going to connect at some point.
Right.
But it seems like it's kind of on a turntable where things are happening, but it's not advancing or progressing towards something.
Or we don't see what it's advancing toward.
Yeah, much more that.
For sure.
I think the storytelling is very beautiful.
Yes.
It's very well written. It's really easy to read. But I have a problem. Like with the Studio Ghibli film, or Ghibli, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Ghibli.
With the Studio Ghibli film, Totoro, I hate that film. It's very cute. The characters are very cute. All that's sweet and all that. But there's no story. So even as beautiful as the animation is, as sweet as the relationship between the sisters are and everything, I'm like, okay, but is this going anywhere? So it's not like it completely felt like that, but that was where I felt like I was wading in water rather than, all right, now we have a plot twist. Now, what is General Fujiwara's complication within all this? We come back to Yuki and it's like, okay, there's absolutely going to be trouble brewing for Jasmine because of Yuki.
Absolutely.
Jujubee has now found herself in a role that is troublesome because her actions have now done the thing that she was most afraid of, which is losing Jasmine.
Right.
So, yeah, I think some of these plot twists within this read has now made me much more interested in continuing on with it.
Absolutely. So what are you predicting for this next read?
For the next read, I'm predicting that Abel is going to continue struggling. I think in our next read might be when Freddy passes away. I think that happens earlier on than later because I think that evolves Abel's character.
Very quickly, yeah.
Yeah. Jasmine is going to start running into some trouble because right now, Jasmine hasn't had that incident.
Right.
And I don't think she gets off scot-free.
Right. I remember last time that I mentioned that she was going to get hurt. I thought she was going to get hurt in this read, but it's gotta happen soon.
Right. Do you have any major predictions?
Major predictions? I feel like Cecily... I think we're going to find out whether or not Jasmine is Fujiwara's daughter in the next read. I feel like not only is Abel's character going to have that big turnaround, I think we're going to find the connection. We're going to see where we've been swimming toward this whole time with Abel's story.
Yeah.
And I think Gordon is going to continue being oblivious to all of it.
I feel like Gordon might pass away at some point.
Maybe.
But the next read is going to be our third out of our fourth read. So it should include possibly our climax within this whole book.
Or leading very close to it.
Right. So we'll see what happens. The next read is going to be pages 165 through 251. So that's in the physical copy. Or chapters 14 through 20.
For everyone else.
Right. And for people that want to share their thoughts and opinions, if you've really enjoyed the book or if you've had like little faults with it and things like that, kind of like my difficulties with the timeline, feel free to share it with us. And how can people do that?
Y'all can email us at asianbookclubpod@gmail.com, or you can join us in conversation on Instagram at asianbookclubpod.
Right. We also have our website, which is asianbookclubpod.com, which has our bookstore that has books that we've read in the past, books that we plan to read, and books that we recommend.
And a great way to support us on the podcast is to rate, review, and subscribe.
Yep. And otherwise, make sure to be happy, be healthy, and read a book.
Ingat. Bye.